So looking at that property continuum, what we've got going on, is that working yet? Yeah, we are rolling. That's cool. So you got the 3 levels of the continuum. The first one is how you arrange the different, I guess, categories or different types of materials and things like that. So looking across a particular grouping, like matte versus gloss, you piece and you place all of the different categories of materials that you can think of along that continuum line. Key things to note, it's not just an order of from left to right. Obviously, more objects might fall more into the matte than they will the gloss, or vice versa. So try to make sure you're pacing these these categories out across the continuum as far as they are. You might find like a lot of them in certain continuums, they'll all be bunched down one end. A lot of the materials all have a similar sort of thing like that. But these single individual graphs are about you trying to figure out, okay, so say we were picking on fabric, we look on matte versus gloss, and fabric generally falls closer, in most cases, towards the matte end of things. But if we think about some of the other pairings and look at like rough versus smooth, or look at hot versus cold, you can see where all the different materials will fall on that. And once you start seeing a common trend that works towards the idea that you're trying to get across, what is the emotions? What are the feelings? Do you want something that's warm? Do you want something that's cold? Do you want something that's soft or hard, shiny or rough? And you'll start to see, okay, well, now I need to start thinking about fabrics. Maybe fabric in this case is the right kind of material, the right category of materials. Now, how do I choose between all of the hundreds and thousands of different fabrics out there? And that's where the 2-dimensional graph can get you a good start. So you start comparing the graphs for matte versus gloss against opaque versus translucent. And you can see how some materials are more matte. So linen is more of a matte material, but it's also more opaque in comparison to voile or organza, which is generally quite see-through. Those two are opposite each other in terms of matte and gloss. So you can start to plot out the different types of materials. So this is the same if you were doing timber. If you took timber, there are different kinds of features and types across all the different timbers, between balsa to hardwood to even things like, you know, mahogany and teak. They all have characteristics. And this sort of plotting on the graph can help you find a way to justify and add a little bit more meaning into your decision to choose one particular timber over another one, rather than it was, you know, I chose Australian hardwood because it's local. That's one thing. But what does Australian hardwood bring to the project on an emotional or sensorial level? And so things like concrete, again, there are different types of concrete or different finishes of concrete, and you can decide how there. And one of my favorite questions for most people is concrete a hot or a cold material? What do you guys think?
A good line. Cold.
Why? What makes you say cold, Tash?
Well, it's always cold when I touch it. But I don't know.
So how's the weather being near you at the moment? Hot during the day?
Yeah.
So if you walk outside in your bare feet on the concrete footpath, how does concrete feel? And that's cool. And that's something people often say to me, it feels cold. It has a cold appearance a lot of the time. And when you see it en masse in a controlled environment, concrete can be cold. You put it out in the sun, concrete can be hot. It's highly thermodynamic in terms of it will transfer and absorb heat and hold on to it for a very long time. And it will also do that to cold. It will also hold on to cold for a long time before it balances out against things. And that's a good property to have. But more about the emotional level of concrete, when you touch concrete, and that again, it will depend whether we're talking rough, broken, old, dirty concrete, as opposed to a polished concrete benchtop. The emotional response quite often falls more into the warm side of things. It makes you feel warmth in terms of, I guess, a naturalness to it and an earthiness and maybe a homeliness. And that emotional side of it can make concrete actually be a warm material. So these graphs are not locked in science, but they're a good way for you to try and use to organize your thoughts, and again, to give meaning to your choice of materials as you move forward, rather than just going, I've chosen polished concrete because it's hard and gray. You can actually talk more to the emotional value that it brings to your project and how it relates to the idea of the narrative. It's hard underfoot, but it absorbs the temperature and it holds on to the heat, and that fits my narrative because of X, Y, and Z. And that's more that way that brings the design rather than the decoration, I guess, in a way. And just choosing some samples because they look good or they're the current trends, as opposed to having the right kind of choice and having the right meaning. And that can help you then, as I said, choose between the different things. Like, why did you choose this timber over the other? What does that mean? What does it bring? The third dimension is just that extra layer again, where you can start to look to see how those particular materials can be, a choice of another material. So you might have a whole bunch. If you were looking for something that was matte and translucent, you might have a whole bunch over here in there. So how can you choose between that little bunch? Well, when you plot them into a third dimension with another value that you might be interested in, depending on your emotion, you can start to see which one pulls towards the side that makes more sense for what you're trying to say. And it can just help refine it a little bit further. So that's the weekly exercise as well. So you should do all of the 10 property groups, and they're listed in the lecture. If you haven't gotten to that already yet, I'll just jump through. Where are we here?
Done.
Yep, the glossiness, the transparency, the colorfulness. So you should do all 10 of those, and you should try to put, 10 or 15 categories of materials along each of those graphs. So you'll end up with a page of those laid out.
Done that.
Yep, from what I can see, you're on the right kind of track there. Yep, and they're spread out. They're not evenly spaced. That's good. They fall with weight towards where they need to. Sorry, what was that?
I had trouble with the 2D.
The 2D, yeah. So the 2D is almost basically the 1D done twice, but for a particular category. Instead of putting fabrics and stone and metal and something, you need to choose one of those categories. So one of those material categories that we had listed like there. So fabric, metal, stone, glass, fluid, paper, plastic, wood, earth, and foliage. I should remember these off by heart by now. And there could be some others, but choose one of those and then look at 5 or 10 different types of that. So I've talked about fabric, I've talked about wood, but we could look at metals, and you could list 10 different metals that you're aware of: brass, tin, copper, aluminium, and those, and then plot those against the two-dimensional graph, which is there. So then take 2 of the things. So if you're thinking metals, obviously matte versus gloss might be something you'd look at, and maybe you could look at transmission, or there's a few different things you could play around here. Is it rough versus smooth? Bendable versus rigid might be one that you might want to play with, because you might be thinking about flexibility in your model or in your space. So how flexible is this metal? And obviously, most metals will be flexible if you make them thin enough. But yeah, you can find comparative ones to put against X and Y, and that'll give you your 2D graph quite easily. It's basically, you just take it as you did it as 2 2D single graphs, and then bring them together, and that'll move the parts up and down as necessary. The 3-dimensional one will be a little trickier, obviously.
Should we do it to something that we ideally are going to use in our model?
That would certainly make sense. If you're already heading down a track you think you're going to use a particular materiality in your final project, then certainly by doing it there to justify the one you have. But do try to do it with something you're not 100% sure on, to see if there is merit in something other than what you've already preconceived as being the option.
So I started doing wood, and I had trouble with it. I didn't know where to start.
Mm-hmm. And part of it will be about you learning too. I mean, you probably don't know all of the characteristics of 10 different types of wood. So it might need a little bit of research or a little bit of investigation to find out what are the differences. Why does a cabinet maker choose between different types of wood for certain projects? What benefits for him or for them does it bring, or what benefits do they feel that it passes on to the consumer? We all know teak's a popular wood because of its value and it's hardware, you know, it is a hard wearing wood, but what else does it bring? You know, and looking at those sort of ideas to really give some extra value to why you've chosen the materials you end up choosing for your thing. I guess the big thing obviously is at this stage, you need to have a clearer idea now, hopefully, of what your key emotion is. What is your core emotion that you're starting with, and all of the associated sensations that it brings about, and how you're going to represent them. So that should drive your choice of initial form usually, and the materiality then is like a scaffolding support to that. So I'm doing this form and I'm doing it out of this material, which adds more grounding to my chosen emotion. Or maybe it's one of the sort of, what do you call it? The orbital emotions that sit around that core one. You know, the guy is angry, but out of anger comes some frustration or comes irritability. So I've got an angry looking shape, but I'm going to add into the materiality. I'm going to use the irritability as something that I'm going to imbue in the material. So I'm going to choose a material that represents irritable. You know, it's going to be uncomfortable to touch. It might be jaggedy or spiky, or it might break off and leave traces on people, something that's going to irritate them about the material. And so that starts to be your second layer of meaning into your project. And then we start, as we move forward, we start thinking about the interactivity and the sound and how we can use, you know, technology as well within that form and those materials to add extra value and bring in some of those other elements. So we're starting to build, you know, a multi-layered experience into what people are experiencing through it. So that's good. So it'd be good to see some of those ideas and sketches and scribbles up on the forums or whatever, wherever you want, and ideas forward, so we can sort of see where you're heading, and I'll be able to, you know, give you some feedback on that, which would be good. Thank you again for jumping on to the Pinterest board as well and sharing some projects there. I like the similarity between your water feature and the water bridge, the little park areas and that sunken water. Why did that stand out to you?
I guess I'm not using water myself. It was linked. I don't know, it's just because it was kind of like hidden in water. I don't know, you're just walking through water, but you're still surrounded. It's kind of,
yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a really cool project. I hadn't seen this top one before, but I'd definitely seen the crossing bridge, and just, it's a different idea of getting across water. You know, as much as anything, it's a different experience, and also brings the human. Yeah, and it brings you down to the water level. It puts you into a different experience, and that's exactly the key point. I also noticed this one here that you posted, the water walls, which again is interesting as you say you're not possibly using water, but again, don't discount it. Explore it as an idea and see if it could fit better than what you were thinking of doing in terms of creating some structure.
Yeah, someone else could use it.
A little point that I'll share for the other guys who are watching as well. Sometimes on Pinterest, it's starting to get a lot more common that a thing or a pin that you find doesn't go anywhere. So this particular pin here, if I click on it, it just takes me to an image. There's no article about it. There's no title, no nothing. And that's unfortunate. It's starting to become a lot more common on Pinterest. So sharing that pin on is great for the picture, but it doesn't really add a lot of detail. So there's a couple of things you can do. In Pinterest itself, you can click the little sort of camera icon in the corner, and it will actually try to find other images like this one from Pinterest. And sometimes that can work, because if you come down, you might find a version of this image that is linked to an article that then gives you some more information. And it's not doing it right now, but it did before. The other thing you can do is you can take the image itself, take its URL, and go to Google. So if I copy this URL, have you guys come across the Google image search, the reverse image search? So you all know searching Google, and you can go to Google Images and search for anything you like. But if you click the little camera icon in the Google search bar, you can actually put an image web address or upload an image you have on your computer, and it will find versions of that image across the internet. and variations, which can help you find the source of an image. So it can also be helpful for your referencing. So in searching that image now, I find a whole bunch of links that talk about the Brooklyn Bridge Park and a bunch of art exhibitions that are going on there, which then takes me through to an article and a video about the artist who's put that on and how he's working with the where is it here? The water. So that water park with walls that pop up. There's also a mirror exhibition, which is actually a really interesting one because it's the kind of experience that would be worth looking at as well for some of our projects, and also a park bench exhibit that he did as well. So it'd be better then to find this page and post that to Pinterest rather than just the JPEG image, especially if you're going to make use of it as well. So the link that I got when I searched it through on Pinterest was actually 10 public art shows hitting New York this spring. And it's a couple of years old because that was a couple of years ago, but it actually talks through and shows some of the projects. This mirrored one was very interesting, I thought, and would be something to use as inspiration for a few people, but there's a whole bunch others there as well. So make sure you're doing the deep research rather than just the shallow. And that'll help yourself and everybody else. Any other questions, guys, that you guys want to ask me today?
Yes.
Yeah, fire away.
Always. The scale model you said to make it to scale, but how do you make it to scale? Because you said it's 100 meters square, 10 meters high. How do we do that? So I started making it, but I'm like, oh my god, I don't even know if it's to scale.
Okay, so to figure out your scale, you've got to figure out how big overall. So if the 100 meters squared is 10 by 10 in a perfect square, but that could then change into something more rectangular or whatever shape you're going to use. So look at your longest dimension and work out what that's actually going to be. And then you need to make that fit onto, say, I wouldn't say your model should be any bigger really than like an A3 page as far as a baseboard. So if you've got an A3 we call it foam core board and treated that as your model extents, and then figure out what scale you're going to build it to so it fits within that. So if you've got to get 10 meters scaled down to fit into, 40 centimeters, you work out the math and work out what scale you need that's going to make your model fit in that, and then work towards that. The scale factor, while it's not about me pinning you for being exactly millimeter perfect for your scale model, it's more about proportions as well. First, it keeps you to an A3 page in size, so you're not building something the size of your house. And it also means that you need to consider, if your walls are going to be thin, what material you're going to use versus walls that are going to be thick. I have had students in the past make a model that's meant to be thin sheets of glass, but their entire model was this big, and they used like 0.5 centimeter thick foam core for the panels, which translated in scale to be about a 50 centimeter thick slab of glass. So that didn't really work in terms of using scale. So that's more what we're looking at, proportions and overall size to make it fit. And that things, if you think the thing is meant to be taller than it is wide, that it is actually taller than it is wide. So more of a proportion thing than that. So it's not a millimeter issue.
All right.
Does that help a bit?
I think so. And do we need to do the inside, or is it just the outside? Is it inside?
Is your space going to be is your space going to be experienced inside, or is it something you walk around? So then you need to either have some parts that can lift off or open up, like you can have it sections in half so that you can show the interior, because that is part of the experience, obviously, being interior designers. So you need to plan out that it won't be to the perfect, we're not talking all the bells and whistles, it's just the overall forms and shapes, so that you've got an idea of how the inside is broken up and what your journey is. What is your narrative? What is your journey? So you can show, here's what the model looks like from the outside and how that relates to anything. And now once I start moving through the space, what are the spaces I've created inside?
Okay.
So
it's still pretty basic, but
it's a form model, yeah. But there, if there's doorways, there should be doorways or gaps that relate to doorways. If there's rooms and corridors, they should be part of the model. Yeah.
Does it have to be a hole that shows a doorway, or could it be a black piece of paper?
You would have to cut a hole so you could, if you would see through it. You don't have to have a door, and by doorway I also don't mean a frame and a door with a handle. I mean more of an opening or a gap. Sort of having a look at some of the paper model examples, you know, something like this one here. When that loads on my slow internet, you know, that's the kind of modeling sort of thing that you could be looking at for your space, but you would have to be able to open up one half of it to show what the interior space is, because that's obviously a big issue or a big concern. So those kind of things, you know, that one's quite heavy. Like this one here shows it's done like in a section. You can pull a wall off so you can explore and show, because you are modeling the journey. So whether it's just one space or it's a twisty walkway or it's a maze inside, that needs to be expressed in your model.
Okay.
So have a look on the Pinterest for some of those ideas. You can see there's also, if you guys go to just my default the Suit On's Pinterest page, I have another category there, another board up there under models, if I can find it here. These going to be in alphabetical today or not? It always changes. Model. So there's a few other examples there of, you know, architectural style models, and these are great. Some of these are a bit beyond the scope of what we're doing. They're like fully finished architectural models, trees, landscape and stuff like that, but they're obviously a good place for inspiration and to see how some of the things are pulled apart and how you can sort of display the information and different bits and pieces. I've tried to keep it to the simpler ones, but you know, even something like this, if you were thinking more of an open or a mesh style structure, this one here, when it comes up, shows a couple of different angles and variations of starting with a flat mesh and then pinning pieces down to actually develop the form, all the way down to a finished structural sort of form and shape. There's a few different ways you can go about it, but the idea is to communicate what the majority of the form and shape will be, and the narrative and passageway through it.
Okay.
The other key thing is obviously keep it to one material as much as possible. You know, you can have transparency and white card if that's what you need, show windows and transparency, but don't be putting timbers and white and blacks and greens and making it look like a materialized model. It is still form finding.
Can I paint it?
Uniform color, yes. That's something that other people haven't been able to get one material to do all the shapes they needed. So definitely unifying it all to white or whatever it is, and preferably white over colors as much, white or black, just so that you create the form and it unifies your material. Yeah.
Because I've been using like a card, like a thick card.
Yep.
And I'm using like masking tape, so I just want to cover the masking tape.
Sure. Not a problem.
That's why I wanted to paint. That's the only reason.
Yeah, as long as the end result end up looking predominantly singly materialed, except for where it's obvious, like something like transparency, then that's the sort of thing we need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. What about you, Faye? Any questions?
I'm good. I'm all good. Thank you.
Okay. Alrighty. Feel free also to post up any progress stuff that you've got, just to share some ideas and let me see where you're at and see if you can get some feedback in between now and next week. And definitely have something to show me by next week's class would be good.
Yep.
We'll see.
Okay. Alrighty. Any last questions?
So, can we have not many lessons to do next week so I can get this assignment done?
There isn't too much. Have a look. It should be up there already anyway. What do we got on for next week's activities? No, there's only one activity on next week's, and it's a bit of an ongoing research one. So basically, you'll see it when you get into the lecture. Even if you can go ahead obviously and read the lecture if you won't hear my recorded version till the weekend. But it's looking at examples of technology and trying to save you guys. The key here is do not reinvent the wheel. We don't have the time to be creating a technology or interactive concept from the ground up. So this lecture talks about how you can sort of take inspiration from one and inspiration from another that does something different and find a way to bring the two together. So like those water fountains that you saw that are just programmed from that one that you pinned, maybe you like that idea, but you want the walls to pop up based on where people are standing in the space. So now you need to connect that to a technology that can sense where people are. And there's lots of ways that can do it. It can be motion tracking. You could actually use their cell phones for location. And when people approach something or proximity sensors, then the water walls would pop up. And having the example of here's a water wall and here's proximity sensors. And if I bring those two things together, you can justify your concept of water walls that pop up when people try to walk through certain areas. That's the kind of idea we're talking about there. So time to jump on also the Pinterest boards. There'll be more examples and links going up this week with more of those kind of interactive experiences. Companies like Team Lab and Kimchi and Chips, who do a lot of really cool stuff with technology and interactive experiences for you guys to explore and try and pick ideas from. Also have a look around. I know there's a new interactive exhibition space going in Brisbane. There's a thing at South Bank, which regularly, in the parklands, it regularly hosts interactive stuff, and Goma itself. But I know Sydney and Melbourne also have a lot of different exhibitions popping up. Sydney had Vivid Light Festival a couple of weeks back. There's lots of stuff if you look at what projects went on there, even if you can't get down to those yourself and see what people are doing. Look around, get that inspiration and see what way you can make people feel something more. Okay, pretty much out of time. It's going to stop recording and, like last week, boot everybody out. But if you've got nothing more, then I'll say goodbye and catch you all through the week.
So,
Cool.
good.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.
Happy
See
study. Cheers.
Ciao.
Bye.